Okay, so now we'll see we're near the cordless phone upstairs, which isn't showing anything right now, but as soon as I turn it on, assuming it works, we'll see what it does. It's even higher than the other one. This is unfucking believable. 129 milliwatts. And as soon as I turned it off, it drops right back down.
You're going to ask me a question?
Yes. Here we are with Penny Hargreaves in Kaiapoi, and she is a longtime resident of Christchurch, and she has a very interesting story to tell of what's happened with her over the past decade or so about, well, you tell us your story.
Well, my story actually began when I came back from England. I'd been training racehorses over there, and I came back here to set up a international horse centre and a remedial animal centre. I've worked with animals all my life, and I found the most fantastic location, 64 acres on the edge of Christchurch, 5 minutes from the beach, 5 minutes from a 600-acre forest, and it was just magic with the river looping around it.
What year was this, roughly?
That was 1992,
okay.
July 1992 I bought the property, and the first thing that was anything that was different was I had 12 cattle, dairy cows, well, they weren't dairy cows, they were fattening cows, and they were grazing in the paddock next to the radio tower that lies adjacent to my property, and I was told when I bought it that it just had 2 AM, very low powered AM on it, and it wasn't a problem. Anyway, these cows were grazing there, and we were at the house. The next minute, one of the cows went absolute berserk. She galloped through about 10 fences, jumped out on the road, and was hit by a car, broke a leg. And when we actually got there, we found that she'd gone completely blind, and we couldn't understand why she was blind. I mean, it wasn't blindness that made her break her leg. Anyway, that was just a very strange occurrence. And then about 18 months later, I had terrible effects one night. I lost 3 of the horses. They died in the most extraordinary circumstances, and then a couple of other things happened as well, and the vet couldn't understand what was going on. The horses were lying on the ground, they couldn't get up, and then I had sheep doing the same thing, and just extraordinary things happening, and he thought someone was coming and poisoning, doing malicious things to them. So we had a police watch for 6 months. That was in 1994. And we'd had no idea what was happening, but they didn't find anybody who was the culprit. And then in 1995, I moved out to live at the farm, and I started getting really sick. I was 49 then, and I was very fit. I could run around the farm in 5 minutes, and I used to ride all the young ones on the beach, and I suddenly found I'd be riding down the beach, and I'd say to my helpers, I'd say, please stop, I'm going to fall off, and they just fell about laughing because I've show jumped internationally for New Zealand and I'm not really an amateur rider, and I was losing my balance and getting this extraordinary vertigo, and then I got to the point where I couldn't even lift a full bucket of water, and I just got sicker and sicker, and my brain went completely lulally, and I had gritty eyes and terrible bone pain, and my animals started getting similar things to what happened before, only more of them. It was quite extraordinary, and the horses that had been winning races suddenly looked as if they were walking on hot bricks, and their coats got very dry and their eyes swelled up, and just cows dying. It was extraordinary. Anyway, we then found out that they'd actually, without consent, they'd actually put very high powered frequency onto this AM only radio tower, and Dr. Cherry had just come back from a sabbatical trip around the world looking at talking to researchers with cell phones, and he came out to see me because we were having a lot of problem with electronic interference on telephones. My Panasonic phone I used to be able to use all over the farm, I could only suddenly use 10 metres from the house.
This is Neil Cherry.
Dr. Neil Cherry, and I think I owe my life to Dr. Neil Cherry, and probably a lot of other people do as well. He said to me, Penny, the illnesses you've got and the animals' suffering and sicknesses they've had can be caused by radio frequencies. And by that time we knew that they'd put this other frequencies, very high frequency, onto the radio tower, which is an AM tower, because it's a very low tower. It's not a high one where the frequencies go over the top of you. They're just going bang into the middle of you. And I still feel terrible, because I said to him, I don't believe you. I said, how can something you can't smell, taste, feel, how can that possibly be causing these horrific effects? And I was quite rude about it. Anyway, he went off with the other people who'd been with him, and I had this awful bone pain, and I thought, well, I'll go and stay with my mother for a night and see if it goes away. If bone pain is caused by the radio tower, I'll go and see. So I went to my mother's, who lives about 10 miles away, and the bone pain vanished almost instantly. I still had the awful chest pain, I still had the asthma, I still felt really disorientated. Anyway, I moved back to my farm, and the bone pain came back again. It's not all your bone, it was like somebody drilling through here and here, like a metre, well, probably 2 metres above the ground and at a metre, and I now know that's where the frequencies actually, that's the height of them, where we were. And then I went to the library and I got a wonderful book, and I recommend it to anybody, and that's Dr. Becker's Cross Currents. And it gives you a very simplistic way of actually understanding exactly what goes on. And
Robert Becker,
Dr. Robert Becker.
The perils of electro pollution.
Dr. Robert Becker is an absolutely amazing man.
A legend.
He actually was a bone specialist, and he got wonderful awards in America for the work he did, which was on healing of bones by using frequencies. But he found if you used too high frequencies or too powerful frequencies, it caused the bone to disintegrate. And then he became very concerned about the effects of electromagnetic radiation, and he started going public on it. He lost all his funding. They would have taken the prizes away from him that they'd given him the awards. But his books are very good to read, because they're not so technical. They're easy for the layman to understand, which I was at that stage. I was a very sick person who was struggling. It affects your brain. It was like I had early dementia. It basically It just muddles your brain up. That's what the electromagnetic radiation does to you if it's too powerful. And I saw with my animals, I buy them because, like anything, we like to have intelligent animals, like intelligent people around us, and you choose them because they're bright-eyed and using their brains. And suddenly my animals that used to be able to learn, you couldn't teach them. They were just like they'd become drongo, and just the same as what it did to me. I turned into a drongo. I mean, people thought that I was an alcoholic because my voice was slurred. I couldn't think. I was no longer articulate.
Now, was this primarily because of your proximity to that tower?
What we've actually discovered is that the very high frequency, the tower's 358 foot high, but what you've actually got is you've got the side lobes. Now, the side lobes are very high frequency, and then because it's AM as well, so within 2 kilometres, the research shows within 2 kilometres of an AM tower, you have an effect. Now, the AM affects me totally differently to the FM, and I've had a wonderful person. I've had this mentor, Dr. Vasil Kurdamalitis, who's actually a Russian and the most highly qualified electrical engineer in New Zealand, and he said they've done a lot of research in Russia, and the different frequencies affect different parts of your body. I can't remember if it's AM or FM affects your lymph and your bone, and the others your brain and your blood. I think AM definitely affects your blood. It affects the clotting of your blood.
Yes.
I think it's probably the lymph as well. I think it's the blood and the lymph.
Yes.
And I think the FM's your bone and your brain, plus everything else. I
Yes.
mean, it affects your whole homeostasis.
Absolutely.
It doesn't just stop at one thing.
No.
It does specifically affect the roost. And I think what actually happens also where the frequencies occur is that everybody has a genetic weakness. Some people have a genetic weakness to arthritis, to asthma.
And it amplifies that.
And it targets your weakness.
Yes.
I mean,
Now,
for me, I've never had arthritis before. I had arthritis, and before I left the farm, I hadn't been able to live there since 1996. My animals had arthritis. I had arthritis. And I think it's because you've got crystals in your bones, and the frequency is attracted to the crystals. Because
Yes.
the crystals, the whole thing of how the radio work anyway.
Yes. Now let me ask you this. Now AM and FM, that's what we call radio. That's radio frequencies. But radio is right. I believe that you've got, when you go down slightly longer outside the visible spectrum, you've got infrared, then you've got microwaves, and then you've got radio. I think, is that right?
I think the higher part of the frequencies they are, the shorter they become.
Okay.
The narrower. I think that the microwave frequencies, I don't have the statistics here with me.
It's shorter than radio.
Yes, the microwave
It was in between infrared and radio. But it's all basically the same thing.
Yes.
Electromagnetic radiation.
And then
That's not natural.
it's not natural, but the worst thing that seems to be, of my experiences of what we're actually looking at, is when you actually have the interaction of different frequencies. And
Yes, the interference or...
Dr. Ross Adey talked about this. His research is wonderful too. He was researching in America, and Dr. Ross Adey's work was where you've got the different interacting frequencies, you can actually make another frequency completely. You've got the refraction, you've got the collision of them, you're making vortexes, you're making standing waves.
Yes,
Now, don't I sound technical?
No, but
I've learned all these
but this
technical
is good, and
things.
you're able to explain it in a nice, clear way. See, people basically are in desperate need of some basic scientific understanding to make sense out of all this.
Well, I don't think it's a basic scientific understanding. It's taken me a long time to learn. I've had this mentor, Dr. Kurtamanitis, who's helped me fantastically and been so encouraging. And of course, Dr. Neil Cherry, who very, very sadly for the whole world died of motor neuron disease. He was working right up to the time he died.
And that came on very suddenly, didn't it?
Yes.
And everybody thinks that he was targeted.
I think when we went to his house, what I suffer from now is an allergic reaction to different frequencies, particularly microwave and FM. Well, the AM frequency just makes my face go bright red and my blood change and stops clotting properly, and I get the bone pain again.
You're a detection instrument.
I'm a detection
instrument.
Yes. Only when I got better, because when you're exposed to it all the time, your whole body's so dumbed down, it doesn't actually react. But when your health starts to improve, it's like some people have said to me before, you know, if they've been in a house fire, their body only has to smell smoke, and it's a panic attack.
Yes.
And it's basically your body says, I mean, my body reacts to it. Very high frequency, I'm dry retching, I'm just folded up, and I just have to get out of the area. Now, Dr. Neil Cherry did monitoring for me where I found it very bad effects. And he said to me at the beginning, because I asked him to monitor where a man had died of a sudden heart attack, and I'd been quite near, and I said, oh, it was very, very strong where he died. And he said, Penny, there's not an eye to this. We don't have an eye to the frequencies.
What does that mean?
Well, it's like an eye of the storm. It's the focus point.
Yes,
you know,
I see.
So anyway, he went and monitored where I'd said to him, and he apologised to me, which was a change to me apologising to him. He said, Penny, where you asked me to monitor was much higher than 20 metres each side. He said, you're quite correct. There is an eye to it. And the eye to it we're actually seeing is where the frequency from the Aruya radio tower at the moment are focused, is that the trees are dying right in the eye of it.
Yes.
Each side of it, they're not. Now, this is the effect we had when we discovered that people were getting very, very sick. It's like the spokes of a wheel going out.
Yes.
And the radio wave bounces, we now know, at 300 metres, 800 metres. When I say bounces, the peak of waves, 300, 800, 2 kilometres, 5 kilometres, 10 kilometres, 20 kilometres. And because it's focused all the way up into the mountains, by the time you get 350 feet into the hills here, it's hitting the ground so hard.
Now, this is just the emanation from one tower without crossing the beams from other transmitters.
Well, this one is so powerful because it's focused uphill.
Yes.
So it's focused onto rising ground, whereas if you've actually got like Sugarloaf up on a hill, it's clear line of sight. You have no obstructions of trees or buildings,
Yes.
so they don't normally have to be so powerful.
So the Urahuria Tower, they took it down when and then rebuilt it.
The Aruya.
Aruya.
What does Aruya mean? I'll spell it for you, because we do actually, if you go to the website, you can actually see our story in Hidden Dangers document. Unfortunately, it has been interfered with by outside
And what's
sources.
the website called?
Ouruhia and it means a battlefield in marshy ground in Maori.
Oh,
And that's quite apt,
very interesting.
actually. Yes, very interesting.
And so, they took it down, and it was down for a year, and now they've rebuilt it since I was here, since we saw you a couple of years ago.
Well, when you saw me a couple of years ago, they'd put up that little tower, little wee tower, which had actually caused devastation before. And the extraordinary thing is, I mean, what happened with the Arua radio tower in September 2010, when we actually had our first earthquake, was the tower actually tilted, it rocked, it tilted, and it sank into the ground, and they continued to transmit. So they're transmitting under as well as over the ground. Now, I'm told by Dr. Kedamalitis, because what I was actually seeing was within the 5 circumference of the radio tower, the only earthquake damage we had in September 2010 was actually where the frequencies focus, where the licenses show the frequencies focus. And the harm only happened at 300 metres, 800 metres, 2 kilometres, 5 kilometres. It was quite extraordinary. And where the actual epicentre was is where the licenses actually show the frequencies focus through the Sheffield area to Lake Coleridge, which is up in the mountains. And it's also in exactly a collision zone of where the Sugarloaf frequency actually focuses into the same area. And what you're actually doing, focusing with those, is they're focused onto a volcanic plateau.
Now tell us what the Sugarloaf is.
Sugarloaf is up on the Port Hills, which is a volcanic plateau.
It's another
of
transmitting
Christchurch.
tower on the opposite side of Christchurch,
And it's a
basically,
hill.
right?
So what you actually have, because one's on one side of Christchurch and the other's on the other side of Christchurch, you actually have collision points.
Like
So-
2 fans crisscrossing, roughly.
2 fans.
I mean, well, 2 sort of triangular areas of emanation. It's much more complex than
I
that.
think it's more like watching a crossroad. You're looking at a road coming from one direction, and then you're meeting a crossroads. And I think it's very much like what you're actually looking at with the CERN Big Bang applicator.
Particle
actually,
accelerator.
Yes, it's actually, and I have a friend who actually is part of that laboratory work, and I've listened to their presentations they do on the big CERN applicator, and that's frequencies going around in a huge big tunnel, and then they cross the frequencies across, so that you've got the collision of frequencies coming across, and that creates the Big Bang. So what you're actually getting when you've got frequencies crossing here in Christchurch on a very high water table, you're actually getting what we've been looking at, and it's been a very long journey to see this, because at the beginning you were just looking at the harm to the animals, the harm to the people, and then gradually, as they increased the power, you saw the harm happening to the trees. The trees were growing this awful bacteria only where it was actually focused, lichen and bacteria, and the fruit became shriveled, and the bees all died or vanished, and the birds fell dead out of the sky.
And this was anywhere within these beams.
Where the frequencies focus, and the other thing that is involved in it is you have what they call radio frequency electronic interference. Now that's interfering with cell phone reception, it interferes with computers, it interferes with everything electronic. So where you've got the electronic interference, you also got electronic interference on the human brain and
Yes.
the heart.
Now, let me ask you, to put all this into perspective, a part of this, on the surface, someone, just a mainstream person listening to this, they could go like, oh, well, these are just accidental side effects from these transmitters and stuff. But we know that there's much more going on than that because of the excessive power levels, because didn't an electronics engineer contact you and tell you that he thought that Christchurch was the subject of some kind of experimentation going on with these kind of energies and stuff?
Yes,
It's not an accidental side effect, is it?
I don't know. What I'm actually looking at is this man actually rang me after we'd published the Hidden Dangers document, which is on our website, she gives the story that happened to us. It gives us quite a lot of Neil Cherry's research and international research. It also gives the fact that the standard for safe exposure is not safe at all, and that the Russians have done a huge amount of research work on electromagnetic radiation, including bombarding people from towers without them knowing what was happening, the same thing as what happened to us. So they then reduced their exposure level to be 1,000 times lower
Yes,
than you actually have here.
Theirs is based on the biological effects model,
Yes.
and ours is based
And
on the
behaviour
thermal
changes.
the
That's
thermal
right.
model.
That's right. But what you actually get, there's one thing they're actually not making allowances for, which is really, really important, is they don't actually make allowance for anybody who's wearing metal. If you've actually got wire-rimmed glasses and you're using a computer, you're actually accentuating because the metal's very conductive. And research that was actually undertaken in 1955, the American Navy did this research, and they said anybody who's using anything electronic must be aware that the metal interaction can increase the frequency exposure between 4 and 27 times.
Okay, hey, let's stop right now.
We've got had metal buckles on their halters. They would get these big oozing blister sores on their faces. Again, we had no idea what was actually happening until Dr. Cherry came and told me what the situation was. And as over the last, we're looking at nearly 20 years, I've had to learn to read science papers. I've been communicating with wonderful people like Professor Johansson in Sweden, who's being persecuted because of the wonderful research he's found. He's done work on skin, which of course is one of the things that happened to me. My hands had big oozing blisters on them from when I moved the irrigation pipes, metal pipes again. Working with people like Dr. Adey, Dr. Becker, and of course Dr. Cherry. And Dr. Cherry's work with the Schumann resonances is just amazing because the whole world works on resonances. I didn't know any of this. I didn't even know the difference between FM and AM. Neil Cherry was actually a meteorologist. He's a physicist, or he was a physicist, a meteorologist, and his interest in the electromagnetic radiation came through the ions, the changing of the ions in the air. The mistral, the different winds that change the ions in the air, also cause depression. They make people suicidal. Behaviour changes. And the incidents, the comparisons are amazing because the radio frequencies change the ions in the air. Now, I might sound like I'm talking a lot of rubbish. I've just studied and studied it because if you get as sick as we got and the animals get as sick as what you've got, you say, what is happening? I was an international horse trainer. I'm not a learner rider. Suddenly my animals changed personality. The male animals became very aggressive. Other male people in the society becoming very aggressive because the radiation affects males in particular. Which makes them become more aggressive. Excuse me.
Is that a sheep at your feet?
No, this is my curly-haired retriever. I've had dogs all the time. Now my dogs at the farm became very sick. All the dogs in the area became sick.
Have you been sick, Spice?
No, she hasn't, because she hasn't lived there. She doesn't live at the farm. So she's never lived there, and she's the only one who's not dead because she's never lived there. But they got epilepsy. They got heart problems. They lost use of their hind legs. They had unusual bleeding from the mouth, bleeding from the anus, bleeding from the nose. And these were so many animals in the area were suffering from this, which I believe comes from the AM because it stops the blood clotting. But the most interesting thing is what we're looking at with the high frequency, which is microwave and the FM, because that's what most of the people are being exposed to at the moment.
Now let me ask you this. Dr. Neil Cherry, correct me if I'm wrong, he pointed out that there's a royal commission of some kind here in New Zealand that, among other things, they set what the quote-unquote safety level power levels for the transmissions of all these things. And he said, correct me if I'm wrong, didn't you say that he reckoned that they allowed the power levels of all these transmitters, FM, AM, and microwaves and all that stuff, to be set at astronomically higher levels than anything that would be legally allowed in Europe? Now, why, if this is true, why would that be?
It's not actually in Europe. What we're actually looking at, there's places like Russia, China, Switzerland, Austria, other places, Belgium, who have actually gone to the Russian level, much lower. They've looked at the research, they're very careful of their people. Now, the inquiries I've been making is something called an origins of the standard. He's talking about the standard. It's not a commission. We had a group of people who are the standard setting committee here in New Zealand, and they're predominantly industry representatives.
Yes.
And they usually only have one person that's independent, but because it's run on a vote, that one person has no weight at all.
Yep.
It's an industry set up standard, and there's nobody to police it. The National Radiation Laboratory, who are the Ministry of Health, at our farm, they actually monitored. They said, oh, the readings are safe. They were monitoring behind buildings and under trees, and they knew safe, and they knew that where they were monitoring was going to be readings of nearly nil, because the buildings were actually scattering the frequency.
Which is a perfect example of how scientists can make things say whatever they want.
Well, it's not so much the scientists, it's what you've actually got, is you've got nobody to police the industry, and you've got nobody independent to police the industry. You said to me before, did Neil Cherry die suspiciously? I was saying that I actually suffer from what they call radio frequency hearing. I call radio frequency allergic reaction, and several other people who were in our group who were trying to get this standard changed. We had meetings at Neil's house, and we'd be in the upstairs sitting room, and all of us would have to go early because we all had such a strong reaction to frequencies in his house. And I can remember him saying to me when I went to his house one day, he said, Penny, I've got 6 chairs here. Can you walk around those 6 chairs and tell me where the frequency is the strongest? And I'd sat in each of them, and I told him which one I was picking up the strongest. He said, yes, that's what my meter says. Now, that was his chair. They were the frequencies. There were 2 or 3 frequencies that were focused on that house, and that actually creates the turmoil, the vortexes, the refraction, which actually makes it impossible for life to live.
And this was Neil Cherry's house.
Yes,
and so he knew this was happening.
Well, he had a lot of amalgam in his teeth, and of course when the frequencies break up the amalgam, they release mercury, and the mercury, of course, is quite poisonous as well. But when we go back to the vortexes, the only way I can actually compare what happens when you have frequencies actually colliding together is to think of 2 or 3 streams or rivers meeting together, or seas meeting, and you get standing waves, you get swirling currents. Fish don't live in the middle of the eye of those currents colliding. They live in the quiet, still backwaters because there's too much whirling and swirling. The only way I can compare the collision of the frequencies creating vortexes, refraction and standing waves is for you to imagine 2 or 3 rivers or streams meeting together, and when they meet they get the whirlpools, they get the standing waves, they get the turmoil,
the turbulence.
and you get the same thing when the same thing when you get oceans meeting. You get the turmoil, you get the turbulence, and fish don't live in that. They swim through it.
Yes.
They live in the quiet backwaters where it's still, it's quiet, it's calm. And this is what we see. The birds don't live where it's bad like that. You're not getting, you get interference with electronics from the frequencies. The birds, the bees, the people, the animals, they don't live well where you've got the turbulence of the frequencies in the same way as the turbulence of the water.
So would you say that all of Christchurch is a region of this electromagnetic turbulence now?
I don't think all of it, no. I think, again, you've got the little backwaters. It depends where the frequencies are actually focused to, because what you've actually got is very powerful line of sight directional beams go from one point to another point.
Now, speaking of those, there's one right behind you.
Yes, there's one right behind me. It's called the Aruia radio tower. It's the one we were talking about before. As you can see, it's at a very low site, and because it's at a low site, it means the frequencies are actually going through people, and because they're focused all the way into the mountains and they're onto rising ground for hundreds of kilometres, you're affecting a lot of people. So you'll get where the frequencies go through, you'll actually get the trees are dead. So what you actually get is there's a real pattern, and this has evolved as they've turned the power up, that where the frequencies focus and the wave peaks, you actually have the trees that are dead. The trees that are very affected are actually pine trees, because each tree actually acts as an antenna.
Now, why do they keep turning the power up?
You tell me.
We
I'd
don't
like
know.
to ask them why, because it's rather like going to a cocktail party where everybody shouts louder and louder. So to actually achieve what they want, everybody turns up louder and louder.
Yes.
So if you had an independent committee controlling the standard and what was happening and said, right, you chaps, you've got to keep these frequencies down to this, and we're going to police you, and if you go over the top, we're going to fine you. Everybody goes down a level. They still get exactly the same reception because they're not competing with each other.
Yep.
But there's no controls. So the important thing is we have to get controls. But here has been me fighting in the High Court for from 2002 to 2013 to try and get our case to be actually put into the court.
Yes.
When I went to the court in 2002 and put my case into the court because the frequencies were higher than what is safe to be exposed to, and by then we actually had that evidence that showed the National Radiation Laboratory was actually hiding the true frequencies. The people who were supposed to protect us were actually causing us harm because they weren't actually making industry show the real exposure.
They've got lots of company in other industries too, don't they?
That's right, but unfortunately the hardest thing with this, with the electromagnetic industry, makes it easy for them to get away with it, is you cannot smell it, taste it, feel it. You can monitor it, but they can turn it down when you're monitoring, which is what they've done
Yep.
as well.
Now, are we going to walk over and look at the tower? Okay.
What
hold
we're
on.
going to do is,
So now you're going to show us the Orahuria Tower.
now what I'd actually like to show you, we're now on the north side of the Waimakariri River. And I'd like to show you because we've got a very clear expanse, and in the distance we can see the tower, and you can actually see how the spokes of the wheel go out from the Aurora radio tower, because that's what you're actually looking at. You're looking at the spokes of the frequency, and where the spokes go is where the harm is actually happening to trees, people, radio frequency, electronic interference. And where the wave peaks at 800 metres, 300 metres, 800 metres, 5 kilometres, 10 kilometres, 20 kilometres, that's where you get this damage to the trees. Now I thought it must go in a line when I first thought about it. I didn't know that you had peaks of waves. Now you can actually see the pattern of the trees as to what actually happens to them. And where we are on the Pines Beach side of the river, we've actually got a high point and we can film and show you what's happening to the trees where the frequencies are focused and how it's killing the trees.
Okay.
If it kills trees, kills people.
Yes.
Kills people, kills animals. So we're actually destroying the whole of our environment.
We are.
We are. Looking at a grey roof there with a line of dark trees in the background, and then you can see the Aurora radio tower, which is at a low height. And then if you swing round to the left in the
No,
hills...
wait, hold on a second. I'm zooming in on this. So now this is the new one that they just put up last
Yes,
year, right?
that's the other one came down because it was damaged in the earthquake. It actually sank in the earthquake and continued to transmit.
And this is on the corner of your farm.
Yes, it is.
Okay, now we'll swing over to the Sugarloaf Tower.
There's the Sugarloaf Tower, which is actually up on top of the hill. Now that's clear line of sight because it's actually high up and above, and it actually goes through above it. But for some reason, this man, Mr. Collinson, who manages the radio network engineering, has turned the radio network FM at the top of there from 32 dBWs, which is 1,578 watts. He's turned it up to 79,000 watts, which is 49 dBWs. And I'm told by people who know about it that that's actually military strength.
So why would they be doing this?
I have no idea why
Is
he's
it
doing
permanently at that level, or he just turns it
No,
up
he
at night?
turns it up. No, just what I particularly noticed was every time we had a big earthquake for 24 hours before, my radio frequency reaction to Sugarloaf and Aurora was huge. And the pattern of the earthquakes, where the epicenters are, is where these actually collide. And also what was interesting was we had sonar ships working offshore where they were actually focusing the frequencies through the high water table, that's Canterbury, through the rivers, through the streams, up to the point where the volcanic plateau of the frequencies actually collide.
Yes, and you noted that it was a seismic exploration vessel under contract to Anadarko Petroleum that showed up in Littleton Harbor right after the February earthquake, and it was damaged.
Well, the press people I've talked to said that the evening of the September quake, the evening before the quake, which was about 6 hours before the quake, it actually limped into Littleton Harbour looking as if a bomb had hit it. Now, the research that I've actually been doing with scientists shows that if a frequency is pushed out, and it's like a boomerang effect, it goes and it comes back again. You know, if you're trying to make quakes happen, which is what radio frequency interferometers can do, sounds weird, doesn't it?
Well, but we know about this from Zbigniew Brzezinski and Gordon J.F. MacDonald.
And also from Tesla.
Absolutely.
And Nikolai Tesla back in the 1900s, early 1900s, actually said, if you focus frequencies, the collision of the frequencies, through the water table, on seismically sensitive land, in the right circumstances, you can make quakes shake. So what we've actually got here in Canterbury is the plains where the Aurora frequencies focusing in the ground when it actually sank, is through the high water table. And then it hits the volcanic plateau, so you can get a resonance effect. You've got Sugarloaf turned right up high, focusing to where you've actually got volcanic vents. And those volcanic vents are like vortex deep into the magna. So if you go back to the CERN work, you're actually creating the same effect. Excuse me, that's called radio frequency cough. I'm picking up a lot of frequency.
Just to complete the thought about I believe it was the MV Aquila, was that seismic exploration vessel that was in
She
Littleton
was called
Harbour.
the Aquila, and she is called the Aquila, the Eagle, and she was also in Littleton Harbour the day before the big February the 22nd quake. Now the extraordinary thing was about the February 22nd quake connected to the Aurora radio tower is that the day before, on the day before the 22nd quake, on the 21st, Mr. Collison, the radio network operator, actually put a station on the guy wire of this damaged tower, which had already sunk into the ground and very badly liquefied ground. And I'm told that the resonance from that guy wire can actually, into the liquefied ground and into the tower that's already sunken, can make it sink more. Now, the Aurora tower sank 3 metres, or approximately 3 metres, the February 22nd quake. And again, we had exactly the same pattern, only bigger.
All right.
We're now looking at the Waimak River here behind us. And on the other side of the Waimak River, it goes along there. It's interesting because you can actually see the pattern. We've got the Aurora radio tower there, then we have a clump of dead trees. Now that clump of dead trees is where the radio wave peaks. Then when you follow it along further, we can't see it from here, but we can film it further around. That goes all the way through to Mount Grey. Then you'll see the trees between that clump of there are not too bad. Then you get an orange roofed house and you see a clump of dead trees there again. And then we see this big clump of trees here. And if we actually walk, let's walk up here a wee bit. Let's just walk up here a bit. We've got the Aurora tower just peeping over the top of that little line of dark green trees. And then we've got all this big clump of dead trees here. Now they've all died, a lot of them, since the earthquakes commenced. But they were dying in lines before that. They were following the spokes of the wheel. Now we're actually finding, because Sugarloaf is actually directed straight through there, directs right through to Kaikoura and Wellington. We have got about 4 frequencies actually crossing here. And then we've got the Aurora frequencies. So it's actually quite terrifying, because what you're actually looking at is a decimation of the trees where the frequencies are focused.
Yes. Now let me ask you something. There are people and scientists that would be aware of exactly what you're talking about.
Oh, there's the most. I've been doing some work with a scientist in Spain, and he's a biologist, and he's doing work around cell towers, and he's actually showing around the cell towers specific trees that are actually dying around the cell towers.
Yes, but what I was getting at is that there's evil ones that know about that. They know what they're doing, and I wanted to ask about.
I don't know if they're evil. I think they've been bought by industry.
Well, okay, now, but just I wanted to. We don't have to tell me too much about him now, but tell us about this guy named Lorne Kuhn.
Lorne Kuhn is not a. Dr. Lorne Kuhn is a person who actually wrote in the newspaper. He wrote in the newspaper, why weren't people looking at, prior to the quakes, there was an increased radio frequency and increased release of radon, and he put this in the newspaper. And I thought, that's extraordinary. There's someone who's actually recognizing what my body's telling me. So I rang him up and I said, Dr. Kuhn, I saw your letter to the newspaper. I'm very interested, because I said, I know exactly what you mean, because every time before a big quake I have this huge radio frequency reaction only where the frequencies focus. And I said, I suffer from radio frequency hearing. Oh, he said, that's a very, very well-researched scientific phenomenon. I said, yes, I understand that now. I said, at the beginning I used to think I was going quite crazy because I'd have these panic attacks for no reason. Now I know I used to have them exactly where the frequencies are because my health is better. I don't hear the radio. I feel the resonance, the vibration, and my whole body reacts to it. And he said, oh yes, he said, it's all very well researched. And I said, well look, I've got these maps that are actually show where the frequencies are focused. And there's a terrific coincidence that the worst quake harm is specifically where the frequencies are colliding from Sugarloaf, Arua, South Shore, where they're actually all rather Sugarloaf being up to 79 dBWs is hugely powerful. And the Arua tower, which was actually sunk, and so it was transmitting under the ground. So anyway, I said to him, I'd like to bring these maps to show you because I understand you're a scientist. Oh, he said, I'm very busy at the moment. I'm very busy in my laboratory. So anyway, I rang him up a couple of weeks later and I said, I'm going quite near you. Perhaps I could call in and see you with these coordinating maps that show the frequencies focus and the quake harm. And he said, oh, I'm very busy. Put them in my letterbox. I said, they're too precious. I'm not putting them in your letterbox. So I thought, this is weird. He's written to the paper about it and now he doesn't want to have a look.
And he said he has a laboratory on Banks Peninsula where he lives?
Yeah, so his wife's got he's actually patented radio frequency for oil exploration.
But see, I couldn't find anything about that online. Do you have any
Yes, I have, yes. And he's done different patents for deep sea divers and people.
That I could see.
Yes, but I mean, a lot of oil exploration is actually done with radio frequencies.
Yes, Brooks
and
Agnew.
they've also found, I was in contact with one man who said he couldn't believe the very low power that he was using on land actually created quakes. So he was very interested in what I was actually coming up with. But when I actually Googled into Dr. Lorne Kuhn, his name is Keuhne, Lorne, Lorne, Dr. Lorne Kuhn, his job before he retired to come to New Zealand, and he took early retirement to come here, was he was actually head of Canada's scientific research, and particularly into the woodpecker program.
The director of scientific intelligence.
Or was it intelligence?
Yes.
So you've looked it up more than me.
Well, but just that's all I could find. So the woodpecker, tell us about that.
The woodpecker, well, I'm not a scientist, but all I can do is tell you it was apparently a Russian exercise that was being used when there was the Cold War on, and it was actually focused under the sea and under the land in America, and people could hear this humming noise, which was literally the frequencies humming under the ground. Now, Dr. Lorne Kuhn, of course, was very involved in trying to protect Canada from a similar assault, because these frequencies, if they are used in a certain way, are actually a novel weapon. And this the Russians actually found out, because their research is way, way ahead of the Americans' research.
Yes.
And is well recognised, way ahead of their research. And of course both the Americans and the Russians were fighting each other, getting as quickly as possible to gather in the Nazi scientific researchers who were way ahead with their electro-magnetic research, because the Third Reich had actually put a huge amount of funding into them because they recognised how they could use the radio frequency operated bombs to actually bomb London.
Yeah, that's how it was a Nazi scientist that invented radar.
Yes, there was one invented radar. I think there was also a British one invented radar. I think they sort of happened at the same time.
Okay.
But what was interesting was that where they launched the ships, the doodle bombs or whatever they were, they could actually activate them to drop by using radio frequency, apparently. But
so you reckon that Kuhn's dad was a paperclip scientist?
I have no idea. I just thought it was his name is I have no idea. I mean, I think I think that a lot of them were apparently the Texan oil people were very keen to get hold of the paperclip people because they said that they'd produced artificial oil. Well, of course, the oilmen didn't want artificial oil. They want to sell their own product. So, I mean, I don't know whether that's true or not. It's not actually in an area I'm looking at.
The truth is probably stranger than we can imagine.
I don't think, from what I've actually experienced with the radio frequency, I don't think people can comprehend what the damage is that these resonance vibrations can actually do to the whole balance of the whole world.
And
We're looking at everything. We're looking at the fish, the dolphins, the whales, the ones that are affected by sonar work is affecting the whales. I looked at birds literally falling out of the sky. When the radio tower, the Aurora radio tower, was demolished, it was like suddenly we had an abundance of birds, bees, rabbits. Everything came back, whereas for 10 years we'd had silent spring. And one of the people who first, when they first found out that the radio tower had it on, he actually wrote to the council and said, "I've got birds falling out of the sky, dead." And this is what we saw, rats, mice, just lying dead. And everything, it was just silent spring. And then they increased the frequencies after the Environment Court hearing. The Environment Court hearing, we had Dr. Hocking from ex-Telstra from Australia. We had Professor Abelin, who'd researched for 5 years around the Schwarzenberg AM tower. They presented evidence to the judge which showed when the frequency was increased, the harm increased only in the direction the frequencies were focused. The judge said, take this off, lower the frequencies, much tighter conditions of consent to stop any further harm. That happened. And Mr. Collinson, who was the radio network operator, completely ignored it and kept increasing and increasing and increasing power. And as the power was increased, the damage to the trees increased. And the trees are the most interesting thing because we can film the trees, we can show the damage in the trees. It's hard to film a person because the cancer or whatever the problems are slowly develops. The same with the animals. But the trees are the example. If it burns the trees, it's damaging the people.
let's show these trees right now.
Yes, we'll just show you a wee bit. It's a plantation of pine trees. The ones at the back are healthy, as you can see. The ones that are in the front line of it, they're damaged. We're not quite so close enough to see it, but you can actually see the pine needles down the bottom have fallen off.
They're rolling.
What you also get is you get the salt coming off the ocean, which is immediately adjacent to us, and the salt actually goes onto the pine trees, which would exaggerate, because where you get salt, it's more conductive. But it's the trees at the front that are damaged, the ones at the back are all right. Now we've noticed this with fruit trees. A friend of mine had lines of fruit trees, and the first one would develop lichen and get sick and die, so they cut it out, and then the one behind it. So they actually become like they're the soldiers in the front line.
Tell us what we're looking at here.
Well, here you're looking at the Port Hills, which is the back of Christchurch. Those are volcanic plateaus, which was made up of two extinct volcanoes. So all of that's volcanic. So Sugarloaf, very powerful frequency, actually can focus on the volcanic vents at the top of those volcanic hills. You're looking at the dead trees. We're looking at a clump here on the right, which is quite alive, as you can see. And across to the left of that, you're actually looking at dead trees, and behind that is actually Aruia, and on the top of it is Sugarloaf. You can see the pattern of dead trees goes right across to where we're looking. You've got dead trees across to the right, and then you've got dead trees in the middle of the paddock here. Those trees are like soldiers standing there waiting to be shot at, because they're individuals not protected by the system we looked at with the pine trees that we just saw a minute ago, like they were the soldiers standing in the front line waiting to die. Now when you actually look across here to the right through the window here, you'll see on the top here of the hill there's actually an antenna on the top of Mount Grey, which is where the frequencies actually focus through, and I'm told they go from there, they send frequencies through as far as America, because it's clear line of sight, uncluttered by anything.
And what is that sending?
A very high frequency would go through there.
But is it for
I don't know.
Military?
I don't belong to the military. I've got no idea. I don't know. I do know that they actually can send frequencies under the sea. They actually, people who do drilling here were taken down about 25 years ago to the Antarctic, and they drilled a 30-metre hole in the ice. And the Americans actually put an antenna in under the ice to transmit through to submarines that were actually in the area under the ice. So when you're actually looking at a tower that's actually sunken, like the Aruia tower sank in September, you can actually understand how the frequencies actually focused under the ground, particularly in a high water table, can cause the oscillation and damage that Nikolai Tesla talked about in the early 1900s.
Yes.
It all sounds really weird until you get into it.
Well, I guess one of the things I'm trying to sort of hint at with you is there's got to be people that sort of that understand what's going on here, and I don't mean the people that are trying to help us, but I mean the ones that are sort of that are the engineers and the electronics and telecommunications and maybe military people that are involved with all this. They've got to know all this, and they've got to know what their agenda is with all this.
Well, I mean, when this chap said to me a long time ago that they were doing experiments here, I didn't believe him. But when you actually had the manager of the radio network tower, when Environment Court said to, drop the frequency was causing harm, and he actually increased it, you then stop and think, well, what is actually going on? And when you also discovered, like when it was increased, that fires were, various places that fires were happening, they were always in industrial buildings where the frequencies funneled in under the corrugated iron, where you have the little ridges, into the electrical. So there were electrical fires in the tops of these buildings, close to cell phone towers and where the Aruya frequency focused. So again, you've got the collision of frequencies, the refraction, and those were creating fires. So then you have to stop and you say, all right, well, we've just had this horrific Pike River mining accident, which was a tunnel, and the tunnel had gas in it. And in the area, they have very high frequency towers up on the top. So if by any chance either, you've got this gas that's released, we're looking at explosions that are actually caused, we're looking at fires that are caused by frequencies, and you've only got to look at garages that have a sign up and says, don't start your cell phone when you're near the garage petrol, because it can cause it to ignite in fires. So then you look at what's actually happening at Pike River and you say, all right, what if they focused a frequency down, or a frequency by any accidentally or deliberately is focused into where there's gas? You can make an explosion. And the same thing we're looking at is where we've got this kiwi fruit disease. What we saw from the Aruya radio tower when they jacked the power up after the Environment Court hearing is we saw fruit trees in the whole area literally shriveling up. Plants on my trees on my, the flowers would become tiny, they get bacteria all over them. So use frequencies, you can actually destroy the growth of vegetables and fruit and the whole area. One of the people near the Aruya radio tower, she's given me a document of what happened at their farm, and she couldn't believe that the spinach was growing in wavy lines, and the wavy lines followed the pattern of the frequencies, and they'd shrivel up where the frequencies were peaking, and they had to give away their orchards, dig them all up because of the effects on them. Well, when the Aruya radio tower was taken down, the trees and the fruit and vegetables and the orchards that were still surviving, suddenly the bacteria had gone. So you have to say, are they looking to see how they can use this as a weapon? I don't know, because...
But there couldn't be a more perfect weapon against life as we know it than something like this, could there?
Well, I mean, I've learned that now, but I mean, it's only been over a long time, and reading a lot and studying a lot and working with absolutely brilliant scientists who are working on what frequencies can do. And
so did you personally communicate with Doctors Becker and Adey?
I have communicated with Dr. Becker. Dr. Becker, they've both died now. I actually put my information through to them as a guinea pig who can actually talk. Because the experiences, I'm an organic farmer, so I'm very observant of, I was an organic farmer in England. I'm also a well-known racehorse trainer. So, you actually, both of these industries are observation. You're observing the health and well-being of your animal, you're observing the health and well-being of your plants. And when you suddenly see something that's inexplicable, and then you're trying to learn what you can do to counteract it. What actually happens, as I understood from both Dr. Adey and Dr. Becker, is that the frequencies actually cause clumping of calcium. They'll actually move the minerals around in your body. You'll get clumping. Now, I saw in my horses over at the farm, they developed big bony hard lumps, like big calcium lumps on their faces and on their legs. And it was quite inexplicable to me, until I actually talked to these people whose research actually showed support of what I was actually looking at. So my animals were in the field, they were working in their laboratories. So my work was supporting their laboratory research, and the same with Professor Johansson. But all of these specialists who actually try to help people, and they're getting their funding cut out by big industry influences, and
Yes.
that's terrifying.
Now, who's the guy that wrote the article in Uncensored who you've been in touch with? John
Weigel, or Weigel, I don't know how you say him. He's actually a Irishman who, this is just one person. You all over the world, we've got groups of people who are electromagnetically sensitive, like I've become. I can't use a cell phone. I can't even be in a vehicle with somebody with a cell phone because it literally affects my whole system. I'm so allergic to just the cell phone. And I've seen horses of mine, the blacksmith will be working on them, and suddenly 1 second before the phone rings, the horses will snatch their legs away or get agitated because of the frequency coming through to that telephone at the blacksmith's and in his bag or wherever.
And we saw with my e-smog meter just how high those are. I couldn't believe the power level coming out of just that cordless phone base station.
Cordless phones are actually meant to be very, very. The work I've been doing is on a different frequency, but I can't sit next to a cordless phone stand, and I can't use a cordless phone. So
No.
I have a real problem. I'm incognito.
You're healthy and in touch with nature. It's the 4 billion or 5 billion mobile phone users and everybody else in the world who has the problem too.
Yeah, the biggest problem for me is, of course, I have a problem flying because flying, you've got a lot of now computers. It's all right if you just fly in the little turbo, the propeller planes, but once you get into these planes that are operating with the very high computer systems and radar, my allergic reaction is shocking.
Yes, and I've learned that a lot of the more modern airliners, they don't have cables that connect the pilot, the cockpit to the steering mechanisms. It's all Wi-Fi. It's all wireless electronics.
Interesting. I didn't know that, but I certainly think that it can't be very healthy for the pilots because they're actually sitting in a metal tube. Well, what we've actually found with the metal is you get this metal resonance, you get the conductivity. So you've got a metal tube that's actually resonating with all this.
Yes, and all their instrumentation, there's probably all kinds of radio frequency and wireless things in there. And also another very dangerous environment is a modern day recording studio.
Oh, is there? I
Yes,
don't
absolutely.
know.
Yeah, there's a bunch of stuff about that. Well, should we stop and go over to Brooklands?
No, we're going to go and have a look at the radio tower itself.
Okay. What are we going to look at here?
Well, we're actually looking at the Aurora radio tower, which you can just see peeping over the top of the hill there, of the trees there. Now, we're approximately 2 kilometres from the radio tower, and the area on the other side of the road, you can actually see where we had worst earthquake damage. You see the dead trees that are here in the paddock. If you just actually move a wee bit back a bit, you can film the ones over there by the cars.
Yep.
Right, they're dead. And back here, across here, there's a whole clump of dead trees. The whole hedge line is actually dead on both sides of the road. And this seems to be where the frequency peaks at 2 kilometres. And again, we've got the dead trees. And again, radio frequency cough getting in. This is the pattern we've got. That's like the spokes of the wheel, narrow area where we're close to the tower. As we get further away, it expands out across to about 2 kilometres, but there's the eye of it that actually kills the trees. So if you live where you've got the peak of it and the trees are dead, you're not going to feel very well either. This is what we're actually coming up with. It damages everything, not just the trees, not just the people, not just the animals, the birds and the bees, the whole environment.
It's killing Mitukaye Oyasin, all my relations.
I don't know about all my relations, but
that's
when you actually find it's shaking the earth as well and the worst damage is happening in the same areas, you have to say, what's going on? What's happening?
It's war on life.
What's happening?
It's a covert warfare.
Well, is it covert warfare, or do they just turn the power up higher and higher because it's like the cocktail party?
But why?
But why? Because nobody's controlling it. So until they get somebody in who says, right, we all go down to the level they've got in Russia, we slow it down. Otherwise, we're all sitting here saying, is this an experiment? What's happening?
Well,
maybe it's just because they're allowed to turn the power up, so they want to go louder and louder.
But I think you and I both agree that the Christchurch earthquakes were not natural. And those were engineered on purpose, so it's part of an agenda that has to do with the resources of this area.
I don't quite know what's going on. All I can do is document what I know about where the transmissions are focused, and that I'm actually looking at where the transmissions are focused and where the frequencies are colliding, is the specific quake damage, and that scientists who are working with me say, yes, if radio towers are located in the wrong locations and they're colliding and interacting on seismically sensitive land, yes, they can cause quakes.
And,
Whether it's deliberate, I don't know.
But we have to talk about fracking and electromagnetism.
Well, I understand from talking to people in Canada that they do use electromagnetic radiation to cause fracking. So whether they're trying to do that here now or not, I don't know. I'm only just documenting what I know and putting it out so that people who are qualified, like the scientists, say to me, yes, if the frequency focuses into water, it alters the oscillation. Yes, if it's under the ground with a high water table, yes, it could cause extreme liquefaction. Yes, where you've actually got the sewer pipes that are metal covered lids, which is what we've actually looked here in Christchurch, the only places where the frequencies focused was where the metal lids jumped out of the ground. Now Dr. Goldsmith has actually told me, yes, the metal creates a vortex that could lift it up out of the ground, particularly when it's focused underneath as well as over the top. But whether it's deliberate, I don't know.